Absolutely. What's the name of the show?
Welcome to the Marty Heiser Show, where you always get the truth. And the only thing you have to ask yourself is, can you handle the truth? I'm Dave Streit. I'm filling in for Marty Heiser tonight. I got to tell you, we've got one of the best shows you will ever see on the Marty Heiser Show tonight. I got a very special guest, and I'm going to introduce him in about 2 seconds. I just want to talk about a couple current event things that we're hearing a lot about in the news right now. We're hearing a lot about the situation in the Ukraine. What I want to do for just a second is roll back the videotape. Let's do a little timeline. In the last 5 years, the U.S. government spent $5 billion to destabilize and overthrow the government of the Ukraine. That is, by their own admission, the State Department said they spent $5 billion. That's where we get those numbers. Then, when all heck breaks loose, the Russians say, you know, this isn't going very, very well, and we're potentially facing genocide for the Russians in the Crimea, so they start to intervene. Then a jet gets shot down, and the entire world is led to believe, just like that Syrian chemical weapons attack, that clearly this had to be the Russians that did it. Well, then what we find out is that a State Department spokesman, Maria Harf, when she was questioned about it, she said, clearly the Russians were behind the attack, because we have social media to prove it. She was relying on Twitter accounts and YouTubes to bring this nation to the brink of war to blame Russia for shooting it down. And then when the Russians produced video footage of radar detection that showed a Ukrainian jet come up behind that jetliner before it crashed, we had no response. They provide evidence. You can argue whether it was true or not. Look, I don't necessarily trust Putin. Putin's a thug. We know that. But what are we doing? What's America doing in the Ukraine right now? This entire thing with the Ukraine and Syria all evolves around energy and pipelines. Russia right now has a stranglehold on Europe. They control the in and out of energy through Syria and through Ukraine. Now we're over there, you know, John McCain saying we should arm the rebels in Syria. Well, that turned into ISIS, and now Christians across the Middle East are being slaughtered. America's foreign policy needs a change, and it needs a big change. On another issue, you know, over the course since Obama's been president, there are 11 million fewer employed people in America. So forget the jobs numbers and all the rest. The total number of people that are unemployed in this country jumped by 11 million people. This week, he came out with his jobs program. You know what it is? You can earn $7,000 a month by housing illegals that are coming to this country. Isn't that a great idea? I think not. But before I digress into complete negativity, I'm going to introduce my next guest. My next guest is the state senator of Connecticut from the 16th District. I had the pleasure of having this gentleman on about 7 or 8 months ago, and he had me spellbound with great answers. Last week on the show, I made the comment that Jesse Jackson's slogan when he was running for the White House about 15 years ago was, I want to take common sense to high places. That is the first, only, and last thing I ever agreed with Jesse Jackson. And Senator Joe Markley, he first ran for office in 1984. Then he went back to the private sector. Then he's come back. This year he's running, as of right now, unopposed. He's got great answers for Connecticut. You know, people, every week on this show, I tell you that the Democrats in Connecticut are hell-bent on doing for Connecticut what they did for Detroit. You know, people like to scoff at that and say, oh, come on, that's not going to happen here. Yes, it is. You know, when you spend consistently more than you take in, when you play games with the numbers, when you drive businesses out, when you don't create jobs, your state crumbles. So, in the next 45 to 50 minutes, you're going to have an opportunity to reach out to Joe and ask him questions. Take advantage of the phone number that's up on the screen there. Call in, get your questions to Joe. When I talk to him on the phone, I constantly tell him that he's more Reagan-esque than Reagan. You know, he has great answers, common sense answers, and it makes sense. And he's very popular in Connecticut, and the right loves him, and who wouldn't want to be on the right? So without further ado, I introduce Senator Joe Markley. Welcome to the show.
I don't know if I get introductions like that, I'm not coming back because I'm just going to let people down. And I am not more Reagan. Reagan was Reagan, out-Reagans me by a lot. So, but I appreciate it. It's very nice of you to say.
Well, that's terrific. Now, we talked a little bit before the start of the show, and one of your, we had Matt Gaynor on last week.
Yeah.
And, you know, when I first met him, it was a few weeks ago, and I said, you know, you sound an awful lot like Joe Markley. And he beamed. He said, yeah, he's my hero. And I talked to Dan Carter before I came in tonight, and he said, oh, you're having Joe on? That's incredible. He's the best guy you could possibly have on. So I won't continue in that vein. But one of the things Matt constantly said was that Connecticut is first in things we should be last in and last in things we should be first in. So I'll just cue it up with a few. Number one, Connecticut ranks number 50th in annual economic growth. That's not a good thing. Between 1996 and 2006, before the economic meltdown, small business growth in Connecticut declined by 2.2%, where the average of all the other 49 states was a growth of 10%. We're driving out small businesses. Governor Malloy framed up the biggest tax increase in history, $1.8 billion. 2 years later, that's not enough. Then we took $6 billion and shoved it off balance sheet. So why don't we start with the first one on economic growth? How do we get the economic engine revitalized here?
Well, the one thing I can't resist saying about the economic growth figure, we are dead last in economic growth since we passed the state income tax.
Yes.
And that was a watershed moment.
Oh, it's temporary though, Joe.
Well, you know, that was a funny situation. My Senate term was already behind me, but I was very involved with my friend Tom Scott in trying to stop the state income tax. We organized that big rally up
65,000 people.
65,000 people, et cetera, et cetera. Really, hey, one of the high points of my life politically, and yet we lost. And there's a moment where you say, so what do I do for an encore? I mean, we had the whole state against it, except for, let's say, the powers that be. They circled the wagons up in Hartford. The legislators, Republicans included, not a majority of the Republicans, but enough of them. And even the Republican leadership was complicit in the end. Once they felt that it was inevitable, they said, well, what can we get to let it go through? Because it's going to happen sooner or later, so we might as well get something, right? I think one of the most discouraging things was that the business community, or at least the official business community, CBIA, the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, was an enormous booster of the state income tax, spent millions of dollars promoting it. Why? Because it gave a break to dividends and interest and capital gains. So the rich down in Fairfield County benefited, relatively speaking. And everybody, the conventional wisdom said, this is the smart thing to do, we have to do it. And it's very hard to buck that when you're up in that world. One of the things about legislators are realtors, they're retired school teachers, they're adjunct English professors like myself. They're not necessarily masters of industry and so forth. You get up there and suddenly you're moving in a world with some very important people, very successful people. It's hard to be in a room full of those people and be the one that stands up and says, this doesn't make sense.
Well, that reminds me of George McGovern after he got swamped by Reagan, right? He started a bed and breakfast in Connecticut.
Yeah.
2 years later, it went bust. And what did he say? Geez, I spent my entire life in the public sector, and I had no idea how destructive my policies were on the business community.
On businesses, yeah. And part of it too, I mean, I feel like the business community, CBIA, not to harp on them, they're my allies and my friends more often than not, but the people that represent them, the association, is not made up of business people. In the end, it's made up of lobbyists and executive directors and people like that are essentially bureaucrats. Mm-hmm. The businessmen are out making the money. And the kind of businessman that you need is the small businessman that we've almost completely driven out of the state. We've slain the goose that has been laying the golden eggs, and it's been a very long process, a process that has taken my entire lifetime to see the state reach the point that it's in. And when you say that they're doing to our state what was done to Detroit, look at the situation we're in. We're going to talk about lasts, but the lowest economic growth in the country, okay. The highest taxes, state, federal, and local combined, the highest taxes per capita of any state in the country. And the greatest debt per capita, state debt per capita of any state in the country. How do you get out of that fix? When the taxes are so heavy and the economy is performing so poorly, it becomes a kind of a death spiral at a certain point.
Right.
The taxes are driving the economy down. The need to balance the budget keeps driving the taxes up. We've seen it happen to our cities here, where in cities like, take New Haven, Bridgeport, homeowners and businesses that are actually in a position to pay taxes can't afford the taxes anymore. Poor retired people, even in Waterbury, a city that I love and that I represent part of, retired people on a fixed income have seen their property taxes go up, 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 because the town is carrying so much unproductive property and so many people that aren't contributing to the tax rolls. It's a vicious circle. And how do we get out of it? We change leadership.
And it's not only is it too expensive to live here, it's too expensive to die here, right?
It's bad. It's bad and it's too expensive to start a business, and it's too expensive to stay in business. And the response of the Malloy administration has been, again, it's been a big government response, which is let's go out and find some big companies and bribe them to come to the state, or even more ludicrously, bribe them to stay in the state.
Or to move in the state, right?
Or to move within the state.
But I mean, how much did Bridgewater get? Was that $20 million to move?
It was $110 million. And they didn't in the end take it. And of course they stayed without taking it. They said, oh, if we're going to move unless we get it. We gave it to them, then they stayed anyways. Because a business at a certain point, they'd say, hey, all you have to do is go down and tell them we're going to move.
Right, shake them down.
Shake them down. But
sounds like a community organizer.
That is, if you're a big business and you can afford the lobbyists and the lawyers and you're connected. Mm-hmm. The little family business, the guy that's running a screw machine shop that inherited it from his father, that's been there for 60 years, no one's helping that guy out. The way to help business is to help him across the board. Start to reduce the tax burden on business, steadily reduce the regulations. That doesn't cost the state anything. To say, in every business I visit, tells me a horror story about regulations here in the state. My father was a small manufacturer. That's really what formed my political outlook. And it was sitting at the dinner table, hearing about the stupid things that he was being made to do, when all he wanted to do was expand his business, hire more people, be more productive. It's funny, I mean, my father was a good example of a man. I don't think he was really driven by a desire for wealth. He loved the business, right? He loved seeing the gear motors go into the boxes and get shipped out. And he loved the fact that he employed people, and he had a good relationship with the people he employed.
There was a movie that came out almost 20 years ago, and it was a Popeye movie that Robin Williams starred in.
Yes.
And Robin Williams, as he floats his boat, the sinking boat, to the dock and comes into this town, there's a guy that follows him around on the bicycle the entire time, just taxing him for everything. There's a dock tax, there's a boat tax, there's a bicycle tax, there's a walking tax, jaywalking tax. That's Connecticut.
Yeah.
You try and start anything here, they do everything they can to ensure that you fail. So, again, some other things we talked about. How does this legislature get away with taking $6 billion in costs for Medicaid and shifting it off balance?
I have a good answer to this one too. We go back to the income tax. And one of the things they gave us to pass the income tax, they said, we get an income tax, but we'll be good from now on, and we're going to put a constitutional cap on spending.
Great.
And every time we bump up against the cap, they say, really, we shouldn't count this. I said this last time. First of all, you got to keep what you got, because otherwise you're not comparing apples and apples. And the second thing is, you would have more credibility if you sometimes came in and said, we're not counting this. This really should count under the cap. It's a one-way thing. All we do is take things out from under the cap. We never put anything back in. So what's it mean? It's just a way to spend more money, and it just shows the only way to control spending is to elect people to office who wish to control spending.
That's why they elected you.
Yeah.
Caller, do you have a call for a senator?
Yes, I do. Joe, love the name. Dave, love the show. Joe, I am entering college this year. What are you doing so I don't have to leave Connecticut when I get out of college and I can come back here? Thank you.
That's a great question. I hear that all the time for kids. That's why Matt Gaynor came on the show, age 20. Doesn't want to have to leave.
Age 20. I was out at UConn not too long ago with maybe 20 or 25 kids, and I asked them, how many of you plan to stay here after you graduate? Two raised their hands. Now, some more I might end up here. Yeah, there's no opportunity in Connecticut. I can't argue with it. What do we do? Another thing I'd say about this is, it has taken us a long time to get into this fix, and it will take us a long time to get back out of it. And the first thing we have to do is stop going in the wrong direction.
Well, I mean, think about this. Why does Florida have the best sports teams? There's no state income tax. You know what I mean?
So players go there and
they say, okay, I can keep an extra $5 million a year. I think I'll do that deal. And the left, they can't understand it. Why would anybody do that?
Yeah,
it's like,
except they do it too. I mean, one thing about it, it's not like the left it's not like they're mendicants. What we have to, what the most important thing I can do right now, between now and November, is to help elect Republicans to office. And I don't say that the Republican Party is going to bring the millennium either.
That's true.
I say that the Republican Party is the party that I have some hope in, and the Democratic Party is the party I have no hope in. So if the Republicans could get the governorship back, which I think we have an excellent chance to do. It's going to be very close. It's very competitive. Everybody listening that wants to see us change direction should do what they can to elect a Republican governor. And the second thing we have a chance to do is to elect a Republican state Senate. We have 14 out of 36 senators right now. If we got to 18 and elected a governor, we would have control of the Senate. Or if we got to 19, we would have absolute control of the Senate.
So who's your pick for the governorship?
Tom Foley. I've been with Foley since the beginning, and I could give you a very simple reason for this. One reason for it is because it's been clear to me virtually since the last election that Foley was going to be the candidate again. I never believed that anybody else was going to be in a strong enough position to stop him. And I felt if that's the case, the best thing I could do, all of us could do, is get behind him as quickly as possible and make him the candidate. The second thing is I honestly believe that he's the best choice for governor that the party has put forward. I think his background in corporate restructuring is exactly what we need in the governorship. And say one other thing about Foley, who I've gotten to know pretty well since the last election, and in part because I've been a supporter of his right along. Tom Foley, when he was being ambassador to Ireland, I think was a good time. But being in the reconstruction in Iraq was tough going. And talking to him about some of the experiences he had over there, he dealt with warlords. He dealt with dealt with some tough hombres. And I don't think that dealing with the Connecticut legislature or with the bureaucrats that he has to deal with up there is going to be difficult for Tom Foley. I think, like Reagan, you know, one of the great things Reagan had going for him was he was a successful man. He was a movie star. He wasn't. He wasn't driven in the way that, say, a Richard Nixon or a Bill Clinton is. If he said, I'm here, this is what I offer. If you take me, great. Otherwise, I go back to the ranch and ride my horse. Tom Foley has been a successful man. He has a good life. I think he'll go in, do what needs to be done. If the people of Connecticut reelect him, fine, but he's not going to be desperate. He's not going to be governing by the polls.
So we had him on the show about 3 years ago. And we've been trying to take credit for launching his political career, but unsuccessfully. And I was impressed. Now, this is a guy that has run a business. Until you've, if I was going to change the world, I would say you cannot hold political office until you've met a payroll. Until you've had to hire people and figure out how you're going to get money in to pay for that. Right? He's done that. And he had some really pretty good answers that weren't canned responses. You know, for example, every time a politician comes on here and tells me that I should elect them because they have a history, they can work with the other party. I think two things. One, that means my taxes are going up and spending's going up. And, Foley came in and he sat down and he was just very matter of fact, kind of like you are, with a lot of common sense responses. I like the guy. I hope he wins too. Caller, do you have a question for Senator Joe Markley?
You know what, I've got a couple of questions, a couple of comments. First of all, Dave, a great show. Miss and Marty, need Larry the Liberal back on the show. So Larry, if you're out there lurking, get on the show. That goes for Big Al too. Al, don't lurk, get on the show. Joe, actually, you and I have spoken. I called you after the firearms vote and talked to you a little bit about the courage you had to vote the way you did, and I appreciate that. For a lot of reasons, not only for myself, but for my family. But Dave, you guys were just talking about what it's going to take to get Foley elected in the state. And Joe was talking about the biggest thing he could do was to get more Republicans voted in, and talking about running a business and meeting a payroll. It's common sense, guys, but Joe, Dave, how do we get that message out to the voters of Connecticut?
How can we do that effectively so we can win this state back? Joe, I agree with you. It's going to take a while, but help me understand how we're going to do that. Well, thanks, guys. I'll hang up and listen.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Yeah, people have to get involved in campaigns. And this is a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years, is working with groups, with the gun groups particularly, to try to get them. They're mad, they're motivated. Go help a campaign. And what a difference, especially a legislative campaign. In a state senate campaign, to have a dozen good volunteers is an army. We have the potential right now, because of these issues, to get 20, 30, 40, 50 good volunteers in a state senate campaign, out in neighborhoods, knocking on doors, sending letters to their friends, making phone calls, all the things they can do. Everybody who's concerned about politics needs to know who is your state representative and who is your state senator. These are the most obscure people in politics, really. People tend to know. You know the federal officials because they're big shots. You know the governor. You know the selectman and the mayor because they're in your town with you. But the state legislators are kind of stuck in the middle. Those campaigns, find out if you've got a candidate. Find out if you've got an incumbent that needs support, or if you've got an incumbent that deserves to be defeated. Is there a candidate? Get in touch with them and go down and volunteer. Get involved. Get on the town committees. It's the easiest thing in the world to get on a Republican town committee.
Yeah.
Find out when they meet, show up. I say to young people, when you walk into a town committee, it's like going into a vampire convention. They're waiting for fresh blood. The same people have been licking the same envelopes for 20 years. They're delighted to have somebody.
So I'm going to come back to disillusionment in a second. But
yes.
Caller, do you have a call for Senator Joe Markley?
I do. Thank you for being on, and I'm glad you're for Foley, and that's very good. I come from a town in which I probably will not vote for my 2 Republican representatives. For 3 years, and it just came that we won round 1, have been trying to settle an issue about Medicare fraud in our town. They have been of no help and have actually obstructed my help, obstructed my ability to do this. What would you do if I had come to you? The evidence I've put to Medicare now, it's taken 3 years. There's fines, there's penalties, etc. I mean, they have been found guilty at this level, and now it's moved up another level. But as far as I'm concerned, I got almost none from one, and absolutely none from the House member from our town. He wouldn't do it because the institution involved in the Medicare fraud, his quote to me was, "She's my friend."
Well, good. Let me.
I would like it would be interesting to hear your response. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, caller.
Yeah, it's a tough situation. It gets into what it is to be a legislator, and the difficulties you have and the limitations of what you can do, and especially frequently with local issues that people want me to get involved in. I'm a great believer in limited government, and to some extent that means I don't believe I should be telling the town council in Southington or the Planning and Zoning Commission what they should do. And I'm very hesitant to get involved. I will try to be, I'll try to be a facilitator. If I see that there's a problem at that level, I try to get the people in the room and say, can't you talk this through? I had a zoning issue to that effect not too long ago, just right near where I live. Another thing I'll say, I mean, this is in a sense a defense of the folks involved, although I don't know anything about it. When somebody calls up and says, "I talked to you," my first thought is, "Gee, did I follow through?"
Actually, with him, he called you, and you called him right. Same. That's how I called you after that gun ban vote, and I said, "I really appreciate you standing on principle. You know what you voted on was the right side. What was put in place did nothing to prevent that from happening again. Nothing. I mean, it was an absurdity.
Yeah.
And you stood. You're one of the few voices of reason. And I called up, and you called me right back. I was like, this guy that calls back.
Well, I call back sometimes. This is the thing. It's just like my emails. You get so many of them.
I can't imagine.
I sit there and I'll start answering them, and people are amazed that they answer. And I think, you're amazed you got an answer, but the guy that was a little further down in the inbox, and the next morning he's further down. So you do the best you can. I got 100,000 people in the district. And although I have various staffers to help me. I've really only got one aide who is my aide. So the two of us scramble pretty hard. And we get involved in these things too. I mean, we have issues with departments, and it can be a very difficult thing to know how to handle. Sometimes simply that, to know how to handle. People will bring things to my attention that I think are very, very bad. But the first thing I have to figure out is, so what do I do? Who do I go to? Do I go to the department that actually is guilty of the fraud? Do I go to the press and try to expose it? How do I play this? And I get more opportunities than I'm able to take advantage of. It's another problem. I mean, I feel like I spend all day with people bringing things to my attention legitimately. And my problem is, to some extent, I think I already have a full plate. I know what I want to deal with.
I can only imagine.
And then I say, but this one is important. It's got to be discussed too. So it's a difficult situation. I do my very best at it, and I know it's not. The first thing you have to admit is, I'm not perfect. None of us are. We're all mortal human beings, and we just do the best we can with the job we have.
Now let me come back. That one young man called in and said, how do we make it possible to stay here? And here's what really worries me. We've had any number of kids between 20 and 25 come on this show. And we'll pose the question, what's the American dream? In the response, they kind of get a puzzled look and they say, to be honest with you, we don't have an American dream. We just try and keep our head above water every day.
Yeah.
And I talk to an awful lot of kids in that 20 to 25, age bracket. And I look at them and I'll start, slowly asking them some political questions. Oh, I don't know. Maybe I'll vote. Maybe I won't. No, I don't know this. Blah, blah, blah. And then I get irritated and I'll say, how come you're not outraged that the federal government is handing you $200,000 in debt the day you walk out of college, not including your college debt, $200,000 in national debt? You should be outraged. You will never pay that off.
Yeah.
How come you're not? And then they kind of go, huh, well, what can I do? And I say the first thing you can do is get organized through social media and create flash mobs. So every time a politician shows up, you tweet it out. You have 200 people descend on that politician and say, look, you're an idiot. You're making it impossible for us to stay in this state. You're driving up debt. You're getting rich off of us, and we've had it. We want you out the door. And only when that happens will we get change.
Of course, that was going on for a little while with the Tea Party stuff. It's kind of it's calmed down. But there was a moment a couple of years ago. Have you ever met Bob McGuffey?
He's been on the show numerous times.
Yeah.
He's
Bob,
the best.
Yeah, Bob and I were friends from the beginning of that, and Bob was the best at putting people on the spot at these town hall meetings.
He's unrelenting.
Yeah, and he's fearless, and he's just a delightful human being.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, but besides that kind of theater side of it, I'm all for that. I like that. But people need to get, kind of my return to politics was coming from that back into kind of institutional politics. So now here I am as I'm a part of the Republican establishment, attempting, I won't say to change it from inside, but to change it. I mean, to make it more effective, to make it more principled. I believe we win by being clear about what we stand for. That's fundamental to it. And I think there's been a mistake, partly driven by the fact that the Republican Party is strongest in Fairfield County, that the Fairfield County approach has been kind of to move to the middle because you got plenty of Republicans. If you're running up where I am, or Len Suzio in Meriden, or Jason Welch in Bristol, or Mike McLaughlin here in Danbury, which territory is basically Democratic, or in some cases very Democratic, you've got to give people a reason to vote for you, and that reason is going to be a strong stand on issues. And we find our own issues. I mean, for me, the busway to some extent was an issue that I developed and made a lot of hay out of. Len Suzio talked about the early release of violent criminals. Taxes, spending, and debt. That's what we need to. But we need to draw a distinction. Everyone's, I don't like taxes. I'm against debt. You need to say something that draws a distinction. I have always said the same thing. I will not vote to raise your taxes or increase state spending by one dime. If Foley's elected governor and he comes in and he says, well, I've got this big deal, but there's a little tax increase involved, I got to say, Tom, I've spent years saying I won't vote for a tax increase, and I can't do it.
Yeah, it's such an embarrassment that it was Lowell Weicker ran on a campaign platform saying that under no circumstances would he support a state income tax.
Yeah.
And he did.
Yeah.
And Roland runs on a platform saying, I will repeal a state income tax that was temporary, supposed to be, it never is. And then he gets elected, and he doesn't. And then 2.5 terms later, he ends up in jail, right? It's absolutely disgusting and unfortunate situation. Let's talk about where we are again in some of these other areas. Debt per capita. This article that I had pulled up said that we had the fourth largest debt per capita at $27,000. You mentioned it was much higher. And then Barron's had an article talking about the financial shape of Connecticut and then said, as a percentage of GDP, our outstanding debt is 17.1% of GDP, which compares to South Dakota at 1%. People, the liberals and the elites, they love to scoff at South Dakota, North Dakota, and those kind of the hicks from the sticks out there. They got to wake up. The economy's out there. I heard not long ago that it takes 3 months to get a room in a hotel out there because their economies are booming. They have the lowest unemployment. They have the best policies. There was a professor from Russia about 5 years ago, and he wrote a massive paper on how the United States of America over the next 50 years would split into 4 regions because people will only put up with stuff so long, and then they vote with their pocketbook and then they vote with their feet. And now what we're seeing is people voting with their feet. So you're seeing the populations of states that have no state income tax go up, economies boom, and the places, like you said, that are creating the death spiral, Chicago, New York State, Connecticut. You don't get out of these death spirals.
Yeah, these cities, the state can't survive with cities which have become black holes, which are just sucking resources into them and have lost all their productive capacity. It's amazing to think of, even when I was a kid, Waterbury, Bridgeport, the industry that used to be in those cities. It's got to return. And I think it will, but it's going to be a long haul. Tell you 2 stories about debt very quickly, since you mentioned it. One was when they talk about the highest per capita debt. I got a publication from a national group, and I get so much stuff, but I'm flipping through it, and I love a good chart. And this has a line graph of state debt, and I look at it, and there's some states that actually have a per capita surplus. They don't have debt at all. And then you have this debt kind of slowly goes up, and then at the top, 5 states jump out that are much higher than the rest of the country. And then of those 5, one of them is sticking out here. And I look at it and I think, what the heck is that state up there? And of course I look and it's Connecticut. I mean, it's not just the highest per capita debt of any state in the country, but it's way out beyond the other states. Why is this happening? I get elected to the legislature every year. The budget secretary comes before us with the budget. And every year I ask him about the bonding. And he says, well, we have a soft cap on the bonding of $1.3 to $1.4 billion a year. I say, first of all, what's a soft cap? I mean, do you have a cap or don't you have a cap, right? It's like a soft speed limit. You got to say, this is it.
I kind of like that myself.
Well, me too. I mean, I feel I have a soft speed limit. The others are 1.3 to 1.4. That's not
it's not very precise,
okay. So I see it, and I say, yeah, but I'm looking at these numbers, and it looks to me like it's over 1.5. Well, Senator, you have to understand it's the fiscal year, and it's the calendar year, and I don't get it. Okay, you're right. What do I know about it? I'm just an English professor. He comes before us, very condescending, incidentally. He comes before us this last time, and I look at it, and I say, now, I know I don't understand anything, but this number now is 1.7 something. How's that under the cap?
It's a really soft cap.
He said, it's still under the cap. The cap is now 1.8 billion. And I thought, man, that's an easy way to stay under the cap. Now, if you think about that, that's an increase. If we take 1.4 to 1.8 billion, it's like a 20% increase in our annual bonding. And already we have the highest per capita debt in the country. And that's all to buy the election. I mean, everything that they're doing with the bonding money is just to pay off constituencies around the state.
Well, and one of the biggest problems that Connecticut has is with state unions.
Yeah.
And state unions will bankrupt the state. Exactly what happened in Detroit is going to happen here. Yeah. How do you, I mean, and they control all the politicians, right? There's enough corruption to go around. How the heck do you rein that in?
I'm not sure. It's funny. I'm on the Labor Committee now. I'm the ranking member. That was kind of a punishment for being a curmudgeon. But it's a very interesting committee to me. It's not something I had dealt with before. I'm not against state employees in and of themselves, and I'm not against the idea of it. I'm not somebody that's convinced that privatizing everything is the answer. We privatize because we've allowed the cost to get out of hand. Mm-hmm. I'd rather, I grew up with a little elementary school that had an old custodian who knew where to kick the boiler to make it work, that kind of thing, and that was part of the community, took a certain pride in it, was there for years and years. All the kids knew him. And I think that's not an unhealthy thing. We can't afford to pay that man $90,000 a year.
Right.
But the idea of having a town employee as a custodian rather than to farm it out where some guy's getting $10 an hour and he doesn't care and it's a different kid every week. Mm-hmm. But we have to control it. We can't. And that means, I don't know. I mean, there's something wrong. There's something wrong with the binding arbitration system that has resulted in constant increases, even at moments when you say nothing else is going up. So you say, well, it's only 2%. It's like, well, yeah, but real life is 0% right now, and taxpayers are not getting raises. And can we just afford to sort of automatically say, well, of course, there's always going to be a little bump? The problem with it, I think the problem that the union members are going to have is they are setting it up for a disaster. And when the disaster comes, then they're really going to get whacked. They're going to find real problems with their, like Detroit, you say you declare bankruptcy. Why? Because then you can walk away from the obligations. Right. You can renegotiate them and pay pennies on the dollar.
Well, and they got less than bondholders got in Greece in the restructuring.
Yeah.
So if you think it's going to end, and that set a precedent, because as far as I can tell, that was the first time that you had a default of that nature. And the way the laws were written, they tried to make it appear that under no circumstances could you default on pension debt.
Yeah.
And then the courts came in and said, clearly, if there's no money, you're not getting paid.
Right.
Right? Now, it's interesting. The Democrats never like to mention Detroit, do they? They just never bring it up.
No.
They kind of run from their record. In fact, in this election cycle, we can talk about this when we shift to more of the national level, every single Democrat running in a campaign right now is running from their record, right? Because on average, they vote 96 to 97% with the administration, and they're all running from the record. So whether it's fracking or immigration, pick the topic, they're running from it. Caller, do you have a question for Senator Joe?
Yes, I thank you. I'm calling again, and I kind of apologize, but I liked his first answer. In my investigation over the last 3 years in my particular matter, it's come to my attention and everyone else's that bigger institutions were involved in the Medicare fraud. The Western Connecticut Medical Group, which includes Danbury Hospital, and one of its local medical groups in our town is also involved. Our police department. At this point, some of this is out of my hands, even as a local resident, because I'm getting pushback, and I'm willing to fight. And I'm 3 years into it, and I'm not going away.
So what's your question for the senator?
What would he do if now we're into bigger institutions which have helped to perpetuate Medicare fraud I have uncovered?
Okay, so the question is, how do you...
no help the politics in my particular town.
So the question is, how do you fight organized crime? Thanks for the call.
Yes, in a sense, that's right. And it's not easy. I tend to believe that people's intentions are good. Even the people that are destroying the country, I think they're doing it because they're in the position of somebody who says, I keep giving this medicine to the patient and he keeps getting sicker.
Yeah.
But I believe in the medicine, so the problem must be that I'm not giving enough medicine.
Right.
Now, at a certain point,
doesn't that define a fool?
Well, maybe, yes. Well, I think it does to some extent, but that's. What can you say? People disagree about things.
Yeah.
But it's not necessarily because it's not because they want to destroy the country. And I guess one thing I'd say about it is, I have a hard time believing that the Department of Social Services does not want to try to provide services to the people that are in need. And that I believe that they would like to crack down on fraud if they can. And I certainly would try to make sure that the Department of Social Services knows everything about what has been found out about this for the listener. And the other, again, much distrusted by conservatives, and I think in many ways rightly so, but the other weapon in a case like this is the press. Mm-hmm. If you can get a reporter interested in a subject like this, it's amazing how quickly dominoes can start to fall over.
Public opinion will turn.
And if you can go to a reporter and say, look, I got this story all tied up, and look at all these pieces of it, sometimes they'll do surprising things. You have to find the hook for them.
Right.
But that's two things that I would consider doing. Again, I don't know. As a politician, sometimes you just say, I don't know. As a politician, what do you just get to do? You get to vote on bills. You get to pass laws. That doesn't really address ongoing bad behavior.
Right. You almost need the FBI to investigate
you do need
that
the
type
FBI
of thing.
To investigate.
Okay. Now, so one of the problems is I often refer to politics as where you can commit crimes without consequences. Mm-hmm. So I was reading this last week that the Consumer Protection Finance Bureau, they were going to do a renovation of that, and they budgeted $55 million. Well, now it's up to $215 million for a renovation of a government building. They just spent our tax dollars. They spent the tax dollars of every kid coming out of college. Yeah. There's going to be no accountability, and if you take the time to dig into that, those contracts went to political cronies, and people got rich off of it. So, and I think the culture in Connecticut is a little bit like that, where you have all the private interest groups, all the special interest groups, prying at the purse strings all the time. Rudy Giuliani went into New York City and cleaned it up, right? And he had to overcome corruption in the police department. I think what it comes down to leadership from the top.
Well, leadership, that's right. It's funny, if you talk about responsibility, it reminds me, if you remember that Waco disaster.
Yes.
And Janet Reno came out afterwards and said, I take responsibility.
Yeah.
And that was it. Then she remained as Attorney General, and nothing happened. And I think, isn't the idea of taking responsibility that you're punished for it, or that you're made to
some
suffer
accountability
for it somehow? You don't just say, oh, I take responsibility, and let's move on, which is what everyone wants to say now. I feel like at a certain point, heads must roll.
Right.
And very few heads roll in the course
of
these
Lois Lerner, maybe?
Like Lois Lerner, maybe, exactly. And you really have to mess up very badly in government to lose your position, and even then, there's a tendency to find something else for you because, God forbid, if you've been one of us on the inside, then you got to be taken care of forever.
Well, I'm going to get this a little bit wrong, but it was either the head of Freddie Mac or Frannie Mae. I think his name was Franklin Raines.
Yes.
And he got promoted, and now he's in the Obama administration.
Yes.
You screw up, get promoted.
After the disaster. And people go from those kinds of terrible situations into the corporate world. I mean, the corporate world is not, to my mind, really the business world.
Right.
It's politics under a different cover. It's not a man getting his hands dirty building a product.
Right. Caller, did you have a question for Senator Joe Markley?
Dave, I do. It's actually for both of you guys, and I'm going to change it a little bit out of the state and out of the nation to a degree to what's going on over in the Middle East. You're talking about politicians here that are absolute, and political organizations, entities are absolute buffoons. Have you guys seen what Jimmy Carter said about Hamas this week? And can you give some comments on that, Dave? I think you had read that, but talk about buffoonery politicians. Love your point of view on it. Thanks.
Yeah, appreciate that. Switching gears over to the situation in the Middle East with Hamas, it was just a miracle that terrorist attack against Israel was discovered before it happened. And I don't know if you heard the comments that Jimmy Carter came out and was trying to, and in fact, Nancy Pelosi said the same thing. They're a legitimate humanitarian organization. And in fact, Obama gave a speech this week, and he praised the Muslim community for their achievements and contributions to building the very fabric of our nation and strengthening the core of our democracy.
Yeah, that's a desire to rewrite history.
Right.
and make our country into something that it's quite different from what it is.
Right.
All that said, we were saying before the show started, I'm of that very small wing of the Republican Party, I would think, that would like to see.
It's growing, thanks to you.
I'd like to see us think about disengaging as much as we can with a lot of these involvement, because it doesn't seem to me that we're particularly good at it.
See, I got attacked for saying that on the show 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
And Marty said, "You want to be an isolationist just like Ron Paul?" And my response was, "Do you think China's an isolationist?" No. You know what? They're gradually exploding all over the country, and they're not dropping a single bomb. And not one of their guys in the military is getting killed in a foreign engagement. Why can't we do that? You know? Caller, did you have a question for Senator Joe?
I had one other comment, guys. I had just called in a minute ago. You know, remember Hamas were the folks that were dancing in the streets when the planes hit the towers. And when Marty was going after you a couple of weeks ago, Dave, I tried to call in, but we ran out of time. But people that want to take the position with our president and Nancy Pelosi that they're a humanitarian group, they need to see the tapes of when those jackals were dancing in the street when the planes hit the towers.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
A humanitarian group is. Wouldn't even consider the Republican Party a humanitarian group, let alone Hamas. I mean, these are whatever else they are. They're political groups, they're interest groups, and they're groups that are using brutal means. And there's no getting around. And brutal means and reprehensible means, and there's nothing to celebrate. But our ability to control events overseas is very limited, and I think more often than what I've seen in my lifetime is I feel like we've done more harm than good. How do we do good? We do good by being strong. Teddy Roosevelt, don't agree with in many ways, but to my mind, speak softly and carry a big stick is tremendous advice.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. You know, it's interesting because America is the biggest supplier of weapons in the world.
Yeah.
We supply more weapons around the world, and we supply them through Fast and Furious to the drug lords in Mexico. We finance and supply weapons to people that overthrow Libya and then come back and kill our ambassadors. Oh, and in Fast and Furious, they're killing our border guards with the guns that, our Justice Department sent them. And then, so here we are shipping these guns around the world. Now, and people are starting to get wise to this and saying, hold it. Why are we giving these radicals, extreme radicals in Syria, these weapons? And John McCain says, it's okay, we vetted them.
Yeah.
It's like, are you kidding? You vetted them? Meanwhile, these gun laws that they're trying to impose on America are taking the guns away from the good guys. The law-abiding citizens that are paying the taxes, financing the guns that we're shipping around the world.
It's funny that the Republican and the Democratic Party, if you look at it over the years, have completely switched position in some ways. Like wrestlers that remain engaged, but they're kind of rolling around. And it's almost like we don't realize that it's happened. That the Republican Party was for many years the kind of America First party that said, let's stay at home and stay out of other people's business and be strong so that nobody's going to give us any trouble.
Right.
And enforce the Monroe Doctrine, let's say. Don't let any threats get started in this hemisphere. And somehow I think because of the fight against communism, and we needed, the world needed to stand up to communism. But the key to fighting communism was being so strong they couldn't attack us. And what Reagan did finally, which was ratcheting up production to the point that the Soviet Union collapsed in the face of the threat. They couldn't match us in an arms race because their economy. Well,
we also sunk them in Afghanistan, right?
Well, they sunk themselves in Afghanistan.
Well,
everybody sunk
surface air
themselves
missiles
in
helped,
Afghanistan.
Right? It's a graveyard of nations.
It's a graveyard of nations, and those guys, those are tough people in that part of the world.
Right.
I think in a way that we think we're tough and we can beat our chest, but we don't live a life like you live in Afghanistan or Albania or some of these countries. We need to look again at what the Republican Party ought to be, and I think that I respect John McCain a great deal in many ways, but I think his instinct to jump in is exactly wrong. I'm the anti-McCain when it comes to that. I'd say the first thing is take a very long, deep breath before we get involved.
Well, yeah, you absolutely can't rush to judgment. I mean, Obama did it with the 17th chemical weapons attack, remember?
Yeah.
That was the red line, and
Yeah.
that was a great distraction from all the scandals that had crept up on him.
It's been one distraction.
Yes.
It's government by distraction. That
Yes.
the way you get out of the current problem is to have another problem come along and bump it out of the headlines.
I've never seen it happen so fast in my life.
Yeah.
So whether it's this border crisis, this immigration crisis, and it's interesting, this whole immigration crisis is a repudiation of socialism, because all of those people down there are fleeing socialism. And meanwhile, the Mexicans really don't want any of their people to come back, but they're hanging on to one of our Marines. Now,
Yeah.
these things just don't make any sense.
The crazy thing about all this is that, again, they want a comprehensive solution. It's one of the things I see in Hartford. Everyone wants to write enormous bills that try to tackle everything at once, and they're inevitably a muddle, and they're full of nonsense, and no one understands what's in them anyways. We could say a lot about that, but we don't need a comprehensive solution to immigration. I would say we need maybe a step-by-step solution. But step one is secure the border. There's nothing else to talk about.
How do you do it?
How do you talk about it? You put up a fence, you send soldiers down there, you do whatever you have to do. It can't be that hard to
Israel's
secure
done
that
it,
border.
right?
Yeah.
Israel built the wall, and you know what? Attacks collapsed.
Yeah, and we're not talking about attacks. We're talking
Right.
about just keeping people from crossing
Right.
a territory. And if you don't have a border, you don't have a country. It's like an open wound.
Well, and either laws are good for everyone or they're good for no one.
Then, once the border is secured, we can figure out what we do about the problem. But we don't have to. That's what we have to do tomorrow. And the states would do it themselves if the federal government would allow them to do it.
Yeah. So, but the left is will pander and say, "Oh, that's just not nice. That's not kind." You know, what we have to start with is we have to, have complete legalization of everybody that's here illegally.
Well, and they play on the fact of sympathy for the folks who are trying to come over. I'm sympathetic to that. Everybody would come here. I mean, half the population of the world would be here if they could get here.
Right.
One of the most unfair things about the immigration situation is, once upon a time we controlled immigration by saying so many people from each country could come here in any given year, so that everybody in the world had a chance. Now we have a situation where basically, if you can get to our southern border,
Right.
you can come across illegally. If you happen to be living in Australia and you want to come to the United States, it's just as difficult as could be. But we're being charitable to the people who just happen, because of an accident of geography, to show up at our back door.
I read this last week that there were people from 77 different countries pouring across our southern
Well,
border.
because people found that they're coming from all over and going across. That's
Yes.
right. I mean, obviously, it seems like the bulk of this most recent wave is coming from Central America,
Right.
not from Mexico itself. It's funny that now the term I see is migrants.
Yes.
And I think if they're migrants, then that means
Then
they're
they
not
go-
staying here, right?
I
They're going to
know,
go
I
somewhere
know.
else.
But-
I don't think you can call them migrants.
No, not at all. Let me ask you, switch gears for a second. Let's talk about, back to Connecticut, legalizing marijuana. Should we have marijuana dispensaries
Hey,
everywhere?
I got a question on this. I do these town hall meetings,
Yeah.
and a young guy, and it was really kind of a gotcha question. And he said, "Well, you're a conservative." He said, "If we legalize marijuana and tax it, we'd bring in tax revenues,
Right.
and we'd save money on prosecution, and it would make Connecticut a destination. How can you be against legalizing it?" I said, "Listen, I know what you're saying. But I would say exactly the same could be said of prostitution. If we legalize prostitution, tax it,
Right.
we stop putting people in jail for it,
Right.
people would come from all over the country to Connecticut. I'd say you have to ask yourself whether we want that to be
Right.
what Connecticut is.
Right.
These things are vices.
Yes.
Marijuana is a vice. That doesn't mean, and prostitution is a vice. It doesn't mean you're ever going to get rid of it.
Right.
Prostitution is something that existed from as far back as
Right.
history goes, and but it also doesn't mean that you say, "Oh well, we're gonna accept it, we're gonna embrace it." It's not a bad thing to say, "No, that's illegal. That's even wrong. That should be discouraged in every way." We're not going to put people to death for it, but we're not going to accept it. I feel the same way about marijuana. I don't think that marijuana is the worst thing in the world. I went to college in the 70s. A certain amount of marijuana was used in my presence. But it's not a good thing. Mm-hmm. It's not something that young people should look at as a good thing. And I don't think that it's Pandora's box. You say, what's the worst that could happen? Well, legalize it, and we'll find out what the worst that could happen is. And the last thing I'd do, I'd say, okay, if we have a laboratory in democracy, Colorado or these other states have gone ahead with it. Yep. I'm waiting 10 years to see what's going on in Colorado before I'd even think about doing anything.
Now, Ron Paul and Rand Paul, they say we got to legalize it, right?
Well, it's a libertarian. This is the tension in the Republican Party between the libertarian instinct and the conservative instinct. Part of the conservative instinct is to say, don't change anything quickly. Libertarians would say anything that you can't justify, we ought to get rid of. Sometimes you don't know what the purpose of a thing was until it's gone, and then you say, that's what it was for.
Right.
What's this doing in this machine? Let's pull it out of
now,
here.
it is in fact driving down prices of marijuana, right?
I have no idea. I can honestly say I don't know anything about that.
Yeah, and suddenly, it may be economical for growers down in Mexico to start planting corn, and maybe you eliminate some of these gangs that are associated with drugs. I don't know. It's a big topic.
I don't think it's the answer to anything.
No, you're probably right. Well, we're down to about the last minute or so. I want to, as always, thanks a lot for coming on.
My pleasure. I was happy to come back.
Yeah, well, you offer a message of hope and optimism. And I'm hoping that we get more young people to watch the show and realize that they can get engaged.
Oh, you can, yes, that's right. If there's one message that people should take, young or old, it's that the political process is open to you. Find out who's running, contact them, say I want to help out, and you'll be in the process. You get on a town committee and you're an insider. The gubernatorial candidates are coming, the congressional candidates, you actually get to know these people. It's very easy to be part of the political process, and it's as interesting as any other hobby, let's say. I mean, you could collect stamps or you can work on a campaign. I'd say working on a campaign will do more to save America.
So you like the conservatives' prospects for the election's only 75 days away, something like that?
I think we have an excellent chance. Malloy is a failed governor, and he's not even a particularly appealing character.
Yep.
I think that we have an excellent chance of winning the governorship. I think we have an excellent chance of picking up enough Senate seats to have control. And suddenly we could go from having nothing in Connecticut to having 2 of the 3 parts of the elected government.
That's fantastic. Thanks a lot for being on the show tonight.
My pleasure.
So for all of you out there, you will be ecstatic to know Marty Heiser will be back sitting right here in this seat next week, and I will be his loyal sidekick laughing at his silly jokes. Thanks, Marty, for letting me fill in for you. I hope you and Carolyn had a great time. Not sure who we're going to have on next week, but you know one thing, you're going to get the truth right here on the Marty Heiser Show. Thanks so much. See you next week. Goes by quick, doesn't it? Yeah.